At 2:17 local time, the operations room existed in a state of suspended calm. The air was dry, filtered, and cold enough to keep fatigue at bay but not sharp enough to restore clarity. Reinforced concrete walls absorbed sound, reducing human presence to little more than controlled breathing and the muted clicks of electronics. A digital clock above the central display advanced 1 second at a time and read numerals, indifferent to rank, history, or consequence. Every person in the room had exceeded the limits of a normal duty cycle. Sleep deprivation showed not in weakness, but in discipline. Movements were minimal, speech economical, gestures deliberate. Coffee sat abandoned, no longer trusted to improve performance. The briefing phase had concluded 43 minutes earlier, leaving behind a residue of probability charts, satellite stills, and threat matrices burned into memory. The intelligence picture was stable by operational standards. Orbital reconnaissance confirmed the target within a margin tighter than the expected dispersion pattern. Signals intercepts indicated elevated internal communications, consistent with readiness but not evacuation. Human intelligence remained incomplete, filtered through delays, compromised routes, and protective silence. No one expected perfection. Sufficiency was the standard, and it had been met. The decision authority stood at the head of the table, reviewing the final operational board without commentary. The plan was deliberately narrow in scope. One action. One window. 12 minutes dictated by orbital alignment, fuel margins, and exposure thresholds. Miss that window and the system would reset into uncertainty, political, strategic, and operational. The simplicity of the plan was not a reflection of the problem, but of the limits imposed on its solution. No discussion followed. Debate had already been exhausted and archived. Consequences were understood but intentionally excluded from the immediate frame. The mandate was explicit: neutralize capability, disrupt command continuity, impose strategic cost. Long-term ramifications belong to policy layers above and below this room, not within it. A junior officer quietly updated atmospheric parameters. Wind profiles remained within tolerance. Cloud cover exceeded visual confirmation thresholds but posed no risk to guidance accuracy. Civilian patterns had been modeled and deconflicted. The target had not moved. The clock advanced. 12 minutes translated into 12 diminishing opportunities to abort, each one narrower than the last. After the final checkpoint, control would pass fully to automated execution. Accountability would remain human, but intervention would not. The decision authority looked once more at the display. There was no visible hesitation, only calculation. The order was issued in a measured tone, stripped of emphasis, calibrated for recording rather than persuasion. It was neither dramatic nor symbolic. It was procedural. In that moment, anticipation gave way to inevitability. Outside the facility, the world continued unchanged. Inside, a sequence had been irreversibly set in motion, one that would be remembered not for its duration, but for everything that followed. The transition from decision to execution was immediate and absolute. Once the command left the room, it ceased to belong to the people who had authored it. Systems assumed control with mechanical precision, advancing through pre-programmed sequences that tolerated no ambiguity. Displays refreshed in synchronized layers, replacing static planning diagrams with live telemetry streams measured in decimals and milliseconds. Fuel systems activated first. Valve states shifted from standby to open, their status indicators changing color in silent confirmation. Guidance units aligned against inertial references, cross-checking star maps and internal gyros faster than human perception could follow. Each subsystem verified the others, building consensus through redundancy. The architecture was designed to distrust single points of failure, including human instinct. The officers did not speak.
Their role had narrowed to observation and verification, watching for anomalies that would justify intervention. Training emphasized restraint at this phase. Manual input now carried greater risk than inaction. The system had been tested across thousands of simulated profiles, from ideal conditions to worst-case degradation. None of those simulations accounted for moral weight, all of them assumed obedience to physics. At T-8 minutes, the first automated checkpoint cleared. A brief tone acknowledged compliance with all abort parameters. No one reacted. At 6 minutes, updated airspace data confirmed no unexpected civilian traffic within the exclusion corridor. The information registered silently, offering relief without comfort. At 4 minutes, the final abort window closed. From that point forward, the sequence would complete unless physically interrupted. The decision authority remained standing. Sitting would have suggested withdrawal. Standing implied neither control nor confidence, only presence. His attention stayed fixed on the primary display, where a simplified icon traced an abstract path across a featureless grid. The real terrain, dense, inhabited, layered with history, existed only in memory, intentionally absent from the interface. As the countdown approached its final minute, the room felt compressed. The ventilation system cycled audibly, its rhythm suddenly noticeable. A pen flexed in a clenched hand. Someone exhaled slowly, deliberately. These minor sounds became disproportionate markers of human awareness within an automated process. Zero arrived without spectacle. There was no shockwave, no audible confirmation beyond a status change on the screen. Mission execution registered as nominal. Secondary assessments would follow on separate timelines: damage analysis, intelligence validation, diplomatic response. For now, the objective was logged as achieved. Protocol required acknowledgement. The decision authority confirmed receipt in a steady voice. The recording indicator extinguished. The clock continued counting, now measuring time that belonged to aftermath rather than anticipation. No celebration followed. No discussion. The participants powered down consoles, gathered documents, and prepared to leave the room. They understood that the action just completed would later be reduced to a sentence, a timestamp, a footnote in official histories. From within the room, it had felt smaller than that, compressed into minutes of procedural certainty. Beyond it, the effects were already propagating outward, shaping reactions, narratives, and consequences that would endure far longer than the decision itself. The first assessment arrived 19 minutes after execution, transmitted through a secure channel that prioritized speed over detail. It contained no imagery, only preliminary indicators: signal loss from the target node, disruption across adjacent networks, abrupt silence where structured communication had existed moments earlier. The language was cautious, framed in probabilities rather than declarations. Analysts knew better than to label outcomes too early. Certainty was something earned over days, sometimes years. Within the operations center, the atmosphere shifted again, not toward relief, but toward recalibration. Chairs were finally occupied. Jackets were removed. Fatigue, long deferred, began to assert itself in subtle ways: slower movements, longer pauses between exchanges, eyes lingering on displays without immediately processing what they showed. The adrenaline that had sustained focus through the decision window dissipated, leaving behind a hollow quiet. Damage assessment teams began assembling their mosaics. Satellite tasking requests were submitted, queued behind orbital constraints and competing priorities. Signals units searched for residual transmissions, fragments of activity that might indicate survivability or redundancy. Intelligence was no longer about the plan, it was about interpretation. What had been broken? What had merely been displaced? What consequences would cascade beyond the intended scope? The decision authority remained on site longer than required. Protocol allowed delegation at this stage, but departure felt premature. He listened as specialists briefed preliminary interpretations, each careful to separate observation from inference. A drop in activity did not necessarily mean elimination. Silence could indicate confusion, concealment, or preparation. History offered too many examples of premature conclusions hardened into policy.
Outside the facility, information began to leak not through breaches, but through absence.
Commercial sensors detected anomalies. Open-source analysts noticed irregularities. Journalists began asking questions that could not yet be answered. Official channels responded with statements that said little while sounding deliberate.
The narrative phase had begun, even as facts remained unresolved. Internally, legal advisors prepared frameworks rather than judgments. Every action would be reviewed against authorizations written months earlier, parsed for compliance with language crafted to balance necessity and restraint. Words chosen long before execution now acquired weight, their interpretations destined to be argued in rooms far removed from this one.
As hours passed, second-order effects emerged.
Neighboring systems compensated, rerouting functions once centralized.
Some responses were automatic, others improvisational. Adaptation was not failure, it was expected. The true measure of success would be whether adaptation restored equilibrium or accelerated instability.
By the end of the first operational day, the initial clarity of the decision had dissolved into complexity.
What had once been a single target now existed as a web of reactions, technical, political, and human. The action could no longer be isolated.
It had entered a living system. Those who had authorized it understood this intellectually. Now they were beginning to experience it operationally. The decision had been brief. The aftermath was already expanding, filling spaces no briefing had fully mapped, and setting conditions that would define the years to come.
By the second day, the operation no longer belonged to the operations center alone.
It had begun to diffuse outward, absorbed by parallel systems that interpreted events through their own priorities and constraints.
Intelligence streams multiplied, each offering fragments rather than clarity.
Some confirmed disruption consistent with projections, others hinted at survivability mechanisms no model had fully accounted for.
None delivered closure.
Analysts worked in shifts designed to preserve objectivity, though true detachment was impossible. Patterns were compared against historical precedents, but analogies proved unreliable. The environment had changed. Technology had evolved.
Actors adapted faster than doctrine. What resembled degradation in one dataset appeared as strategic repositioning in another. The same silence that suggested success also carried the risk of misinterpretation. Within policy channels, the language began to harden. Briefings prepared for senior leadership emphasized control and proportionality. Slides reduced uncertainty into bullet points. Caveats were included but minimized, placed low on pages or spoken quickly. Decisions made in 12 minutes now demanded justification measured in years.
The framing mattered as much as the facts.
Diplomatic systems responded cautiously at first. Requests for clarification were phrased neutrally, allowing space for denial or delay. Allies sought reassurance without explicit endorsement. Adversaries probed for weakness through rhetoric and posture rather than immediate escalation. Everyone watched for signals, understanding that reactions could shape trajectories as decisively as the initial action. Meanwhile, operational planners began contingency work almost immediately. Success created new risks. Gaps left by the neutralized capability might invite competition, internal fragmentation, or opportunistic actors previously constrained by the status quo. Stability was not a default condition, it required maintenance. The absence of one node altered balances across an entire network. The decision authority reviewed summaries late into the night.
The material no longer resembled the clean logic of the original plan. It was layered, conditional, unresolved. He recognized the familiar pattern, and action taken to simplify a problem had, in practice, expanded it.
Not through error, but through interaction with a system too complex to remain static. Public narratives began to solidify by the end of the week.
Headlines framed the event as decisive or reckless, depending on perspective.
Timelines compressed cause and effect into digestible sequences, omitting uncertainty.
Once established, these narratives would resist correction, shaping perception long after classified assessments evolved.
Inside restricted channels, a quieter understanding took hold. The operation had achieved its immediate objective.
It had also set in motion dynamics that could not be recalled or neatly resolved.
Future decisions would now be made in an environment altered by this one, constrained by precedents it had created.
The 12-minute window was already receding into abstraction, referenced more often than remembered. What endured were the conditions it produced: new alignments, new tensions, new assumptions about what was permissible. The decision had passed quickly. Its consequences were only beginning to take form. Years later, the decision would be cited as a reference point rather than an event. It appeared in briefings not as a narrative, but as a line on a timeline, a datum against which subsequent developments were measured. Analysts who had not been present during those 12 minutes spoke about it with confidence shaped by documentation rather than memory. The language had stabilized. What was once uncertain had been codified into terms that suggested inevitability. Institutions adapted first. Doctrine was revised incrementally, absorbing lessons without acknowledging fault. New procedures incorporated assumptions derived from the operation's perceived success, treating its outcomes as reproducible rather than contingent. Training scenarios replicated its structure, emphasizing decisiveness within narrow windows, reinforcing the belief that compression of time equated to control of complexity.
Operational environments, however, did not conform as neatly.
Actors affected by the decision learned from it in parallel. Some decentralized further, dispersing capabilities to deny similar targeting. Others accelerated timelines, reducing observable preparation phases. Silence became a tactic rather than a symptom.
The absence of signals no longer reassured, it provoked suspicion. Technological investment followed these adaptations.
Systems designed for precision expanded in scope and autonomy. Human oversight remained nominally central, but practical dependence on automation increased. Decision-makers trusted processes refined by precedent, even as those precedents aged. The 12-minute window became a benchmark, shaping expectations about how quickly authority could and should be exercised. Politically, the decision altered thresholds. What had once required extended deliberation was now framed as manageable within constrained timelines. The vocabulary of urgency gained legitimacy. Leaders referenced the operation to justify speed, arguing that hesitation carried greater risk than action. Opposition struggled to counter examples that appeared operationally clean, regardless of their broader effects. For populations indirectly affected, the consequences were less abstract. Infrastructure disruptions reshaped daily life. Power structures shifted unevenly, creating vacuums in some regions and consolidation in others. Adaptation favored those with resources and flexibility, while marginal actors bore disproportionate cost. These outcomes were rarely traced back to a single decision, but they accumulated along its wake. Within intelligence communities, debates persisted quietly. Some analysts questioned the durability of the original assumptions, noting that stability metrics had not improved uniformly. Others argued that the absence of catastrophic escalation validated the approach. The lack of definitive failure allowed the decision to persist as a model, insulated from full re-evaluation. The decision authority retired within the decade, his role reduced in public accounts to a title and a date. Interviews, when they occurred, focused on leadership under pressure rather than consequence management. Personal reflections, if they existed, remained private. Institutions preferred clarity to introspection. As time extended, causality blurred. New crises emerged, layered atop unresolved tensions. Yet traces of the original decision remained embedded in policy logic and operational reflexes. It had become part of the environment, unquestioned, inherited, and increasingly invisible. The 12 minutes no longer felt brief. They felt permanent. As the decade progressed, the decision's influence became harder to isolate but easier to assume. It functioned less as a precedent than as an underlying condition, an accepted feature of the strategic landscape. Planners no longer asked whether such an action was possible, they asked only whether circumstances justified repeating it. The threshold had shifted quietly, without formal declaration. Institutional memory played a decisive role in this normalization. Personnel rotations ensured that few remained who could recall the uncertainty of the original moment. What survived were documents, metrics, and summaries refined through repetition. Each iteration reduced ambiguity, replacing lived tension with procedural confidence. Risk, once felt viscerally, was now quantified, bounded, and therefore easier to authorize. Opposing actors incorporated the lesson differently. Some concluded that visibility equaled vulnerability and pursued opacity as doctrine. Command structures fragmented, not out of weakness but as a deliberate defense. Authority dispersed laterally, slowing response but increasing survivability. This adaptation frustrated traditional assessments, which relied on hierarchical signatures that no longer existed. Others chose acceleration over concealment. If decisive action could be taken in 12 minutes, then preparation cycles had to shrink below detection thresholds. Mobilization compressed. Warning times eroded. The margin for misinterpretation narrowed until routine movements risked being read as imminent threats. Stability became brittle, dependent on flawless interpretation in an imperfect system. Technological systems absorbed these pressures unevenly. Automation expanded to manage speed, not to replace judgment but to approximate it faster than humans could. Oversight mechanisms remained in place but shifted from direct control to post-action review. Accountability followed the same path, migrating from the moment of decision to its documentation afterward. Public understanding lagged behind these shifts. The original decision was remembered selectively, often framed as a necessary response to an exceptional circumstance. Its complexities faded from mainstream discourse, replaced by simplified narratives of strength or restraint. In this environment, repetition felt less like escalation and more like continuity. Within closed forums, concerns surfaced intermittently. Some warned that accumulated adaptations were converging toward instability, that compressed timelines left no space for correction once sequences began. Others countered that restraint could not be assumed from adversaries who had already internalized the same lessons. The logic became circular, self-reinforcing. The decision's greatest consequence was not what it destroyed, but what it normalized. It redefined what speed meant, what authority could look like under pressure, and how little time might be considered sufficient to alter history. The system adjusted around that definition, tightening its tolerances, narrowing its options. By the time new crises emerged, distinct in origin but familiar in structure, the 12-minute decision was no longer referenced explicitly. It did not need to be. Its assumptions were embedded in protocols, its logic encoded in software, its cadence reflected in how leaders were trained to think. The moment itself had long passed. The shadow it cast had not.
The final assessments were never labeled as such.
There was no document that declared the consequences complete, no briefing that closed the loop. Instead, evaluation became recursive, folded into annual reviews, strategic outlooks, and long-range forecasts that treated the original decision as an immutable variable.
It was no longer questioned, it was accommodated.
By this stage, the language surrounding the event had fully stabilized. Words like exceptional and extraordinary disappeared, replaced by terms that suggested manageability and control.
Risk was no longer framed as something to be avoided, but something to be scheduled, bounded, and absorbed.
The decision had altered not just outcomes, but vocabulary, and vocabulary shaped perception.
Generational change completed the transformation.
New analysts entered the system with no memory of the conditions that preceded the decision.
For them, the environment it helped create was the baseline.
Training materials began with assumptions that had once been conclusions. Scenarios were constructed around compressed timelines and irreversible sequences, teaching decisiveness as a virtue independent of context. Outside formal structures, the effects manifested unevenly. Some regions adapted through resilience and diversification, learning to function amid persistent uncertainty. Others calcified, their institutions weakened by repeated shocks that traced indirect lineage back to that initial moment. Cause and effect were no longer traceable, but correlation accumulated quietly. Attempts at retrospective critique surfaced periodically. Academic studies, classified reviews, and internal red teams revisited the decision with updated data. Their conclusions were nuanced, conditional, and often inconclusive. The absence of a clear counterfactual, no parallel timeline where the decision was not made, limited every analysis.
Debate persisted, but without resolution.
The decision authority's name faded further into abstraction. It appeared in footnotes, then appendices, then not at all.
Responsibility diffused across systems, committees, and doctrines.
What had once been a human judgment became a structural feature, detached from the individual who had carried it.
The irony was subtle but persistent.
A choice made under extreme time pressure had produced an environment in which time itself felt perpetually scarce.
Compression became the norm.
Deliberation became suspect. Systems optimized for speed struggled to accommodate ambiguity, even when ambiguity was the dominant condition.
Nothing collapsed outright. That was the enduring justification.
The absence of catastrophe was cited as proof of sound judgment. Yet absence was a weak metric, measuring only what had not happened, never what had been foreclosed.
Paths not taken left no evidence, only silence.
What remained was a world slightly narrower than before, its options constrained by precedents that no one remembered choosing. The decision had been brief. Its residue was structural, embedded in how power was exercised and how quickly it was expected to move. The 12 minutes were long over.
Their imprint was not. Block B. In the end, the decision was not remembered for its precision, its timing, or even its immediate success.
It endured because it changed expectations. It taught systems what was acceptable, leaders what was feasible, and institutions how little time they might require to alter the course of events. Future crises unfolded under this inherited logic. Each one was framed as urgent, each one presented with narrowing windows and irreversible sequences. Whether these constraints were real or constructed mattered less than the fact that they were believed. Belief, reinforced by precedent, carried operational weight. Some decision-makers sensed the trap. They recognized that speed, once normalized, became a demand rather than a tool. Resisting it required justification as rigorous as action itself. Choosing to wait began to look like deviation, even when waiting was prudent. The burden of proof inverted. Others embraced the cadence fully. They trusted systems refined by repetition,
confident that automation and process could substitute for time. Their confidence was not unfounded, but it was incomplete.
Systems optimized for rapid execution excelled at repeating known patterns, they struggled with novelty.
Across decades, this tension persisted unresolved. Periods of restraint alternated with bursts of decisiveness, each justified by selective readings of the past.
The original decision was invoked less as an example than as a reassurance, a reminder that action had once been taken and the world had continued.
And it had. That was the simplest truth.
The world absorbed the shock, adjusted its structures, and moved forward. But absorption was not erasure.
Adjustments carried cost. Movement followed altered paths.
Historians would later argue over significance. Some would claim the decision merely accelerated trends already underway. Others would contend it redirected them. Both would be partly correct. The decision mattered not because it stood alone, but because it interacted with everything around it. 12 minutes had been enough to initiate that interaction.
Decades were required to live with it.
In the quiet spaces between crises, when urgency briefly receded, the shape of that legacy became visible not as a single line of causality, but as a pattern of constrained choices and shortened horizons. A world trained to decide quickly learned, over time, that speed was never free.
The decision had ended as soon as it was made. Its consequences never did.